Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to the Hoon, where co-host Peter Bale and I go around the week's news in geopolitics and Aotearoa's political economy with a whole bunch of experts, academics and politicians, all to understand our worlds better and have some fun. Tēnā koutou katoa. I'm Bernard Hickey, co-host of The Hoon. And remember, The Hoon is the plural for kaka, for those people who may not have wondered.
Yes, and Bernard,
it's
you've
not
got
just
a slightly crunchy, just 1 second, you've got a slightly crunchy mic sound there. Is that possible, Simon, just before we bugger this whole thing up? But I just want, better if we fix it now than...
Crunchy.
Yeah. All right. No, it just sounds a bit as though there's a sort of loose wire somewhere, but that may well just be you.
It probably is. I occasionally have a few loose wires.
Yes.
It is great to see you, Peter. I'm here at the Spin-Off Studios at the moment, and you're across town in Hoon Bay.
I am. I'm waiting. I'm preparing to receive you for dinner this evening, Bernard. Which is, people think we probably exist in different universes, but it's always lovely to have you over. And, feed you a little bit, because I know you don't get much sustenance on the island.
That's not true. I get plenty, sometimes too much. But it is wonderful to see you and have everyone on board. I see the numbers building at the live channel. It's great to have you. This week is going to be another cracker because there's no shortage of news. But Peter, you wanted to talk about the media a bit first.
Kind of I do. And we don't have Elaine this week. Elaine is driving from her university in Indiana over to DC. But it is a big week for the media. It is a big week for the media in the US. Again, another reason I sort of stood Elaine down, apart from her being in a car, was we can't make it about Trump. However, two things. Donald Trump has attacked Michael Wolff, who's as we know from previous years, a friend of mine, who's published his latest book in extraordinary speed, called All or Nothing: How Trump Recaptured America.
Goodness me, he must be like living in the printing plant.
He is a machine. He is a machine. And as I've said before in interviews about him and for him, and I've interviewed him, in fact, he is much more like Tom Wolfe in a way than Michael Wolff. He gives a broad sweep. He does not have an index. He does not have necessarily named sources, but I can guarantee that his sources are superb. And one of the ways we know this now, but with this latest book, is that Trump and his team have gone absolutely ballistic about it. And Stephen Chung, who was the rather unpleasant he was the head of Trump's election communications, and he's the head of White House communications, described Michael as a lying sack of shit who routinely fabricates stories originating from his sick and warped imagination.
In brackets, must be true then.
Well, exactly. And he's described him as having a peanut-sized brain. And then Trump said, let's always remember with Trump, try not to actually in some senses, but this is the President of the United States going after an author who's had the temerity on his own social media platform. And he said, Michael called me many times trying to set up a meeting, but I never called him back because I didn't want to give him the credibility. And then he says, everybody else didn't talk to him either. But I assume, however, he was able to speak to a small number of people, but not meaningfully, i.e. there's some really good shit in that book and some, things that are embarrassing. It just shows that Trump surrounds himself with mad people. There's a very good... Right?
Now he's in charge of the most powerful country
in
the world.
That's right.
Who is voting with Russia in the United
Exactly.
Nations.
Well, can we get onto that with Robert Patman
Sure.
in a minute? But the other thing to this, Robert, is Bernard. Trump has also attacked the Wall Street Journal today, and the Wall Street Journal, and this will become even clearer. Many people here listening to us will know that the Wall Street Journal has a sort of the news department. It has an opinion department, and the opinion department has always been on the fringes of kind of right-wing bonkery. And not unreasonably, the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal questioned the whole principle of tariffs. That has led Trump to say, I need to work out ways to now sue the Wall Street Journal, Michael Wolff, any media that criticizes me. And I think we need to be really careful. I think this is actually much more, like we've seen with Ukraine, this is much more serious than it looks. And to have a president attacking the media in this way. And we talked a little bit last week, I think, with Elaine about the AP initially being banned from Air Force One and from the White House briefings for refusing to call it the Gulf of America. And now the White House press secretary has taken over control of who is admitted to the Trump press conferences and to the White House. Effectively, they've eliminated or taken over the role traditionally performed by the White House Correspondents Association. And you can imagine, given that he's just put a ratbag called Don Bongino, who's a podcaster in as the deputy head of the FBI, you know the kind of nutters who are going to be allowed in. Joe Rogan, great spreaders of what J.D. Vance calls Soviet words like disinformation and misinformation. There's going to be some extraordinary stuff going on in that White House press corps. And so, speaking of Washington and that separation of powers historically in the US between the editorial pages, the comment pages, and the newspaper, Jeff Bezos has blown apart 90 years of history from the newspaper that gave you Watergate and the great courage of the Graham family in publishing the Watergate and the Pentagon Papers revelations. And
there's a couple of good movies on this if you're remotely interested in finding.
And he has said, Jeff Bezos has said that from now on the opinion pages of the Washington Post will support free markets and individual liberties. Now, this is also the man who stopped the Kamala Harris endorsement, which I can understand. So his comment editor has resigned. They've lost already 300,000 subscribers from that last contretemps over Kamala Harris. And, this is quite a dramatic. I mean, this is a guy who said he had would have a hands-off approach. And I was really struck that the former editor, Marty Barron, of the Washington Post, just said this shows that Bezos has been bought. Now he's bought it as much as you can buy one of the richest men in the world, but he's decided his commercial interests are more important than the integrity of the paper. I noticed today that the app no longer has the "democracy dies in darkness" phrase on it.
Because you could argue
I suspect
democracy
the site will. Yeah,
because you could argue democracy died, past tense.
Kind of. It's quite an extraordinary. And again, people are very kind to us sometimes. In Elaine, there is an inside baseball aspect to this. The way U.S. newspapers are structured can be very self-serving in a sense for the journalists, and there's this kind of church versus state thing. But Jeff Bezos has just driven a stake through the heart of the church at the Washington Post, which is the opinion section. It also follows really nasty, racially tinged attacks on a Washington Post commentator, writer, journalist Eugene Robinson, who of course is black and who criticized Trump and the cowardice of the rest of the Republican Party for not standing up to him. Also this week, NBC has fired, I think, 3 non-white leaders of shows, presenters of shows, and replaced them with white presenters, pretty much after they were criticized by Trump. There is something very dark going on here. It's not just happening in the Pentagon.
Yeah, and although we're a long way away and we think that we don't have the sort of interference in our media from the government that you might see in other places, it was interesting to see this week NZME, the owner of the New Zealand Herald and News Talk ZB and a bunch of community and regional daily newspapers, coming out with its results and saying that it would set a new tone for New Zealand. It would focus on taking a leadership position to help New Zealand thrive using its various platforms, including the New Zealand Herald, to support the reboot and acceleration of New Zealand's economic recovery.
Yes, and how you can do it Property.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sharing stories of success and building positive momentum. So the tone of that statement, you could argue, was very much pro-growth, pro-business, and
Which is not which is a position.
yeah,
The Herald has historically been quite conservative since it was a Southern Cross and was an enthusiastic supporter of the Waikato Wars and so on. It's a settler paper.
yeah. But it's
Or was.
quite an a statement to say that we are setting a new tone for New Zealand, and we're going to use the New Zealand Herald to do it, and to do it at a time when they're letting 30 journalists go, so to speak, including some of the most experienced and, you'd have to say, some of the most critical journalists and commentators of the government, and doing it while making a net loss of $16 million, but at the same time paying a dividend of $16 million.
Well,
I think
that's partly because the net loss, Rob Bernard, as you know, was, and we should explain, was partly because of write-downs on them selling closing rather most of the community newspapers, most of the local and.
That's right. But even when you look at their cash flow generation, that actually dropped, but they are still using that cash flow to pay dividends rather than invest in their.
Excellent. Well, they're supporting capitalism, Bernard. I mean, when you come over, who do you think is going to be paying for your fish? It's not the socialists who are going to be providing your fish. It'll be the capitalists. Well, I can probably magic them out of thin air. I mean, when we're moving to Catherine in a moment, we will also be taking this misinformation, disinformation thing through, because I will explain to her in a minute what that was about. But a couple of things have happened to me in the last 24 hours, which I've looked at, about people who have gone down the rabbit hole of conspiracy theories and disbelieving media. And I would just say to our lovely audience, I mean, we're very grateful you listen to us, but again, just think about, even if some of the media you're reading is inadequate, just think about what it is that the politicians and so on actually want to replace it, or what they're calling fake news. There are at least, even if the Herald has said it wants to support the New Zealand economy and our optimism and thrusting into a golden new Luxon future, that's fair enough. But also, if they make a mistake, they will usually fix it up. There's an ethical there.
Yeah, no, we'll try to shine a light on this stuff as best we can, and it will be interesting to see how that all develops. Unfortunately, one of those leaving from the New Zealand Herald is its climate reporter and science and environment reporter, Jamie Morton. So another task. Another task for us to try and cover these areas closely. Catherine, lovely to see you. Welcome into the show.
Yeah, you too. Kia ora.
Yeah, and Peter, you've been down some holes, and you've got some stories
I've been down some holes. So, a relative of mine who I love, but who has gone down very deeply down a conspiracy hole, sent me a number of Joe Rogan excerpts. One of which I decided to discard when I realised it was Joe Rogan interviewing Mel Gibson. Which is a kind of homoerotic right-wing love fest where they might as well have done it in a mud bath. But one of the things that they were discussing, Catherine, was a very good report a little while ago that was in the Washington Post about, I think it's 485 million years of climate data. And even I wasn't around 480 million years ago. But essentially the point that was being made was, there's always been warmth, and in fact, if you look at it, the line is down. We're much colder than we were before. So all this stuff about, and of course, and what they're compressing is effectively the industrial, since the Industrial Revolution, into a sort of tiny little blip.
They're actually condensing the whole of human evolution.
Correct.
Into
which I often try to do myself. Yeah. So, Catherine, how are you? One of the things that I would love you to do is talk about the way, because my nephew I've just admitted who it was. My relative sent me this and just said, this is why I and my family will not be listening to the mainstream media. This is all a conspiracy. How do we counter this with our own families? Do you want to give us a couple of sites or a couple of places that you think people can get good information from?
Yeah, I mean, there is, quite a bit of research into the whole area of disinformation and misinformation going on at the moment. Of course, those are two different things as well. So one's deliberate, one's accidental. But in terms of climate change anyway, one of the websites that I've always referred back to, and I have been looking at this website probably at least once a month for over a decade, and that site is called Skeptical Science. It's spelt with a K, which is the American spelling, even though the guy who originally set it up was based in a university in Australia. It was quite a bit of it is aimed at American audiences as well, so they didn't want to exclude them by not being able to spell things alternative ways. But that site, when you go to it, it looks quite old-fashioned because it kind of is set up the same way it was over a decade ago. But it is an excellent site. It is run by a group of climate scientist volunteers, and they actively debunk all of the common stories that you hear about climate change. So that one, the climate's always been changing. That is the number one piece of misinformation that you will hear around, climate denial discourses. They cover that. You can look at, within that coverage, you can look at a top level, easy to understand scientific argument against that, or you can look at a much more extended and much more technical and in-depth scientific explanation of why that story is wrong. So they have it split up into different layers. They've also done a bit of research around the idea of inoculating people against climate denial and climate misinformation. So how do you talk about these, those kind of stories? And one of the things they say is you don't lead by saying what the false narrative is. You lead with what the truth is, and then you know.
Is that the truth sandwich idea?
Yeah. Well, the shit sandwich.
That you lead with the truth, put the crap in the middle. Well, which reminds me of an old joke that a friend of mine said many years ago, that life is like a shit sandwich. The more bread you've got, the more palatable it is.
Yes. Speaking of bread and making things palatable, or at least getting influence, Catherine, we've got a piece of research out from a university in New Zealand about the influence of the road lobby in our political debates. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
This is such a great piece of research, and the lead author on that is Dr. Alice Miller. She originally trained as a medical doctor and is now doing her PhD. So this piece of research came out as part of her PhD research, and she was looking at exactly what the who the transport lobby groups are and what they're doing and how effective they're being. And it's a pretty sad story. She's basically saying that they're using techniques that are recognisable, of course, from other powerful lobby groups like tobacco lobby group, and so on, using the same sort of techniques, and that they have been so effective in Aotearoa that some of our more recent changes in our road transport policy could have been written by those road transport lobbyists.
Oh, but Catherine, that would be almost as bad as the tobacco industry writing our smoking policy.
Yeah.
That couldn't possibly happen.
Seems like such a familiar story.
And it really does illustrate the problems we have with a lack of disclosure about how our lobbyists get in and out of the parliamentary complex to start with, a lack of disclosure about the types of donations and support that political parties get. And also, we don't have a lobbyist register. They have one in America. Our laws about disclosure of donations to political parties, you could drive a truck through, usually being driven by Winston Peters. And we've got a problem. We think we're safe and that we're clean and that we're not like those.
And also that we're transparent
Americans.
When we're not. We're not safe and clean, and we're not transparent.
There's actually a piece of research that's come out recently, but New Zealand, in terms of the transparency index, is sinking, and it is largely because of this treatment of lobbying. That there is so much now that has become invisible to the public, and that is happening, behind closed doors, and that there's a lack of, visibility and clarity on those things. So, it is actually affecting the quality of our democracy, put it that way.
And just on some good news to finish off on the climate front, some good news out of the Antarctic, maybe.
Oh yeah, there's been a bit of a study. So we talked last year about the fact that in terms of ocean currents and things like that, a lot of scientific research is done in the Northern Hemisphere because that's where the scientists are based, and there hasn't been so much. I mean, obviously we have scientific research happening, but it's not as prolific in some areas as it is in the Northern Hemisphere, and that we had a lack of information about some of the things happening around effects of ice sheet melting in Antarctica. And so this is a piece of research that looks specifically at what sort of impacts can we expect from an acceleration of ice sheet melting into the waters around Antarctica, and specifically how does it affect New Zealand? And that, I think what a lot of people were really worried about is that there might be some hidden beasties in all of this, that there might be things going on that we hadn't recognised, like potential for ocean currents to collapse, like the AMOC story that we've heard a lot about, or, just things that we haven't recognised because we haven't done enough study on it. And what this piece of research actually came out with was some kind of mildly good news, where they actually said that
hidden beasties here.
No hidden beasties here, that the cooler waters, particularly southeast of New Zealand, could mean that some of the effects of warming that we see over the next few decades will actually be slightly less than they would have been otherwise. So they were talking about something like by 2100 days over 25 degrees of extreme heat, instead of having an extra 27, we might only have an extra 25. So that is kind of mildly good news, but I think the subtext here is the no hidden beasties story. Yeah.
Catherine, just on this, to close on this, and when we're bringing Robert in very shortly to do the international section, and it sort of applies to that as well, because I did find this note from my relative somewhat upsetting. In fact, it was 3 or 4 pieces of Joe Rogan bollocks, and another one from that original Musk claim that Reuters and other news organizations were being paid millions by US aid. One of the things that happens with something like a story about climate change is that people seek comfort, seek reassurance that they haven't made the bad choices, that their lifestyles that they don't need to get a electric barbecue instead of a gas barbecue, or a BYD double cab ute instead of a Ford Ranger. How do we address that? You're such an intellectual. You've looked at this question of how we move people's opinions.
One of the big things that I think is happening at the moment is that when we're having big climate impacts happen, like Cyclone Gabriel here and Hurricane Helene in the US, that people are feeling a bit abandoned by the state, like they're not getting as much support as they might expect. And that very quickly leaves an opening for distrust of state, and therefore distrust of fact-based stories and scientists and all of those sort of things that go along with it, which gives an opening for people who are spreading climate disinformation. I'm actually working on a research proposal at the moment that kind of tips into some of this stuff. So we're looking at,
because it's so easy to ignore it, or it's highly desirable to ignore it, because it's so discomforting. It could force you to change various lifestyle decisions.
Well, for a long time, we've kind of had people saying, when the big climate events happen, that's when we'll start taking it seriously. And in fact, the opposite is happening, and that kind of suggests that disinformation has the potential to be a negative social tipping point, where it tips us towards maladaptation or towards not dealing at all with the situation. So I agree. I think it's a really big deal and something that's worth. Yeah,
I noticed, Catherine, today that one of the British climate authorities suggested we start eating less meat in England, and so next will be the attack on Christmas as well.
That was in the last IPCC report that we should be eating less meat, so that shouldn't be news to...
Yeah, bloody socialist vegan conspiracists.
Part of our research, when you talk about who's going to feed you the fish, we kind of say it's not the state and it's not the markets, it's probably your neighbours. And so commoning is probably a really good response to some of this lack of institutional support and institutional failings when it comes to dealing with these...
Catherine, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Speaking of socialist vegans, Robert, how are you?
I've never been described in such terms before.
No, Professor Socialist Vegan.
No. I mean, anybody who knows me, well, those two terms of vegan and being socialist is almost, well, it doesn't quite fit, but never mind.
Yeah, well, I bumped into the celebrity chef Peter Gordon the other day at New World, as you do, and he said he was looking for vegetables, pretty much, I think, because he'd just been to a kind of meat celebration of New Zealand meats, where he'd eaten and cooked and eaten, hopefully in that order, tomahawk steaks and the like.
Right.
And as we all know, I mean, this is going to bring the socialists out on the live chat as well. I went to the engine room the other day in Northcote, opposite the cinema, and they do the most amazing steak frite. I mean, best steak frite out.
We're losing
Paris.
our vegan audience here, Peter.
Yeah, exactly. They also do a very nice cheese souffle, by the way.
That's going to lose them too. Yeah.
So,
but
Robert,
anyway.
I put on this purple shirt just before you came on, or before I wasn't sitting here shirtless, because there is an episode in Michael Wolff's book about Boris Epstein, the rather hideous, overweight Trump lawyer, turning up to a Zoom conference shirtless. So I didn't do that, but I did want to, because I've got a star one with the star upon theirs, like a sneech. But it also, because we're all men today, we like strong men, and I wanted to ask you about the strong men approach to politics. He said, doing a bloody difficult segue there.
Oh, that was around and about. But anyway,
Well, it
good.
depends what you mean by strong. So-called strong men. Mr. Trump describes himself as strong, but he's incredibly weak when he deals with Mr. Putin. And I think the Chinese are privately incredulous. Of course, they're backing Mr. Putin, but they're astonished that the most powerful country in the world has basically tried to mediate peace on the basis of Mr. Putin's talking points. It's not as if Russia has a huge economy or anything like that. Economy is about the size of Spain's, about the 11th, I think. You can correct me if I'm wrong.
That's kind of Italy, I think. But Spain's thrusting along and Italy's collapsing, as is Russia.
And so it is, I think we have to use the term strong leadership with inverted commas. It seems to me it's selectively strong, and that's probably being charitable.
What did you think, Robert, when you heard that the United States had voted with Russia and North Korea
And Belarus and Israel
against the UN resolution in support of Ukraine against the Russian invasion?
It's immoral and strategically counterproductive. And the United States, which has enormous soft power in the world, irrespective of who's in the White House, is frittering away a lot of goodwill at the moment at a rate of knots. And I know a lot of Americans are the most demoralised of all, particularly those interested in foreign affairs. You only have to
or interested in moving to New Zealand. Yeah,
Michael McFaul, the former U.S. ambassador to Russia, and a whole series of people who've got a serious interest in foreign affairs in the United States are incredulous that the United States could effectively line itself up with authoritarian states. And of course, I suppose in one sense, Trump's behaviour as president, particularly that vote you referred to, confirms what many people felt, that he's not particularly worried about democracy or human rights, and had no problems about an insurrection on the 6th of January 2021, and if that's what's necessary to keep power. It's interesting, though, that in a sense, this transactional approach, which Mr. Trump lauds so much and believes it's a source of strength, is actually projecting weakness on the international stage. And it's the law of unintended effects, I suppose, is kicking in. But I wouldn't say I was shocked by it, because I think Trump, he has a sort of track record, doesn't he, of doing incredible things and doing some very controversial things. I actually thought it was very sad that the United States, which had done so much to create the post-war architecture after 1945, creating institutions where small and middle powers can have a say. It may not have had a huge effect, but it was a step in the right direction. And here you have the United States effectively losing its leverage by siding with the likes of Russia and North Korea. The Biden administration, of course, and previous administrations had already made inroads into reducing America's commitment for a rules-based international order. After it illegally invaded Iraq in 2003, it set a precedent, which of course the Russians were happy to use in 2014 and also 2022. But I still think it's a low point in American foreign policy. And I think...
And Robert, just on that, we also have Zelensky going to Washington tomorrow. Zelensky, who looks as though he's had his mouth gaffer taped shut since last week's outburst, and he would appear to be signing an agreement. Who knows whether it will last the Trump presidency or hopefully, potentially to do effectively a transaction where the United States gets some right to the rare earth minerals and so on that Trump the United States needs, but from Ukraine. I mean, that must be. Have you seen anything like this before? What happens when your students say to you, "Excuse me, can we go back to 1938 and look at realpolitik?"
Yeah, but let's be quite clear here. Zelensky is a pretty wily political performer. He knows that Mr. Trump's foreign policy towards Ukraine is going down very badly, even amongst many Republican supporters. In fact, the New York Times carried a piece that many Republican members of Congress have got absolutely panned by their constituents over Trump's support for Putin. And Mr. Zelensky knows a lot more about American politics than Trump knows about Ukrainian politics, I suspect. So what's he doing? It was Zelensky's idea to explore the possibility.
Oh, really?
Yes, he initiated it at the end of last year, but of course not on Mr. Trump's terms. And when Mr. Trump wanted effectively Ukraine to sign away half its mineral wealth for
for $500 billion.
Yeah. Zelensky was very quick to point out the Europeans are giving more than the United States. So I think I personally think he's setting Trump up.
Yeah.
He's going to go to Washington. He's trying to be reasonable. Why is he doing this? Because the Europeans have offered a much better deal. And before he accepts that, he's got to convey to America, who he genuinely was grateful for the way the Biden administration reacted so sharply after the invasion. And also he hadn't forgotten that the Americans telegraphed Russian intentions by removing the usual restraints on intelligence. He was grateful for that.
He's a master negotiator, though.
Who?
Trump, by revealing, he shows you his cards before he plays them.
But this is another interesting thing. All of the people working for Trump now have to issue obligatory flattery before they can actually answer questions. They have to talk about the master deal, the greatest deal maker on the planet.
Yeah.
This is like a banana republic where everybody, has to run around the boss and say how brilliant he is. I'd like to see what you guys say about Trump effectively now determining who will cover the White House.
Robert, that's an excellent segue back to the beginning of the show where we did discuss that quite extensively. And then I'm going to bring it back to you because we discussed disinformation with Catherine.
Yeah.
And the brazenness and there is an AI video that Trump shared today, which is by somebody else, of the vision of what Gaza could be like if
the only thing that surprised me about that particular video is that I expected Trump to present himself as a very, very slim sort of Adonis.
No, well, that's what I mean. Clearly, it wasn't done by him. But even though the golden statue was essentially the Saddam statue that was pulled down and hit with shoes and so on. The most disgusting image, of course, was Netanyahu. Both of them rather fat, overweight men in Speedos by the pool. But this,
and also, was it Elon Musk consuming vast amounts of food in the video?
Yes.
Did you see that?
Yes. But this brazenness, this outlet, when you're thinking about this, and particularly when you're in front of students, I wonder what because do you include disinformation and misinformation, or disinformation in particular, as a weapon of foreign policy? The way, are you having to rewrite some
No, it's
aspects of your
interesting.
lectures?
I've just started teaching a first year paper, which I love because there's about 170, 200 students, and they're really keen and very passionate. And they're just starting university. Many of them have come out of high school or taking a year out working, and they've come back. The way I approach it in my Introduction to International Relations course is I say to them that we've got to develop the tools to rigorously check what people tell us about the world, or even about domestic politics, actually, because the same principles are right. And so I don't actually say to them, because my experience with bright young people is if you patronize them, tell them that this is wrong or this is disinformation, then I think, to use a sporting term, you lose the dressing room. I was given very good advice when I started my career by a professor who was just retiring and I was just starting, and he said, remember, Patman, that 15% of all the students in front of you are brighter than you. They're just beginning going down a road that you've already travelled. And I've always stuck to that. So there's going to be people in that room who are going to do far better than I've ever done in my life. But the point is, it's much better to pique their intellectual curiosity and give them the tools to if you like, confound and confront the likes of Trump and what they're saying, because Mr. Trump is being completely cavalier or economical with the truth, to put it mildly. But I don't go into a lecture and say, oh, Mr. Trump was lying or something like that, because that is judgmental, and it means that I'm trying to impose on them. It's much better to encourage them to develop the tools where they can develop intellectual independence.
So Artie Farty 87 says, cool info, Professor, thoughtful. And I'm going to start calling you Patman from now on. I'm going to do it in the voice of Rowan Atkinson.
I studied at the University of Surrey, and that's why it's very hierarchical.
Patman. So talking of tools and a message for your students, they are all welcome to the top fully available version of the Kaka as students. Anyone who signs up with their university or Polytech email account has full and free access, and we'll upgrade them for no cost. So being subscribers to the Kaka might help there as a tool.
Tuesday morning at 11 o'clock, I will mention that, Bernard.
Oh, fantastic.
You're always marketing, Bernard. For God's
I'm a hustler.
sake.
I'm always hustling. So, Robert, I'm curious about what you thought of the German election results and how the Europeans are responding to Trump's actions.
Well, I think the AfD did pretty well. They got 20%. They didn't do quite as well as they hoped. They were talking about 24% at one point.
Maybe
and of course, Elon Musk was egging them on to get 25%. I think that's the slightly sobering news that they got 20%. The good news is that 80% of the German electorate voted for parties other than the AfD. But we can't diminish the AfD's achievement. They are a far-right organisation, and there's a political firewall against them imposed by the other parties.
Are they far-right, Robert, or just charming populists who have a good understanding of the people's views?
No, they're very far-right. And
they're proposing things like...
you talk to Germans
explain why. Explain why they're very far-right.
You know in no uncertain terms what they think.
Robert, just explain why they're very far-right, please.
Because of their policies. And because, in a sense, they have said that Weidel, the leader, I've forgotten her first, is it Alice Weidel?
Yeah.
I think it's Alice Weidel. The leader has been, and she's not alone. Many of the top AfD leaders have made points about that we shouldn't be too apologetic about Germany's history, and we shouldn't have Germany has been paralysed by its guilt complex. And so we get this airbrushing of history. Whereas I think Germany, if you look compare with many other countries, Germany's done remarkably well in facing its past.
Absolutely.
Its horrendous past in the 30s and the 40s. And I think quite a lot of Germans are proud of that, and they don't want to see this eroded. Let's be quite clear. AfD has a lot of international backing. Been a favourite of Mr. Putin for a long time, and their young people go to Moscow and for training. Now they're a favourite of Elon Musk. This is very interesting. the convergence of interest between Putin, Musk, and Trump. And it's very difficult to explain why the most powerful country in the world has simply not demanded that Putin remove his troops from Ukraine. I mean, he would have won a lot of applause if he did that and threatened Putin. And China can't have any complaints because it's no secret that a lot of the Chinese leadership are not happy about Xi Jinping's policy.
God, you're doing excellent segues today. There's just one intrusion here. Dallas Graham from our audience says, of course they're right-wing. They eat meat 3 times a day. Robert, we had a little exchange today just to sort of set you up and see what you were going to do this with segues. And we were both struck, I think, by the comments from Winston Peters, who sounded a little bit, as Private Eye used to say, tired and emotional, describing the relationship with China as the special relationship. That he'd given them some warnings. But I found that, and of course, I've lived in England a long time. The special relationship for me is really between the UK and US and is equally bogus. But tell us a little bit about that.
It's interesting, isn't it? And it's also interesting he traced it to 2008, whereas I actually think New Zealand had a distinctive relationship with China much earlier.
Well, was he just one second, was he the foreign minister in 2008? Yes. I think he might well have been.
Yeah. So, but it was New Zealand that sponsored China's admissions to the WTO.
Absolutely.
And
New Zealand opened the embassy in 1972, immediately after Nixon's visit.
So there was quite a lot of firsts in New Zealand's relationship with China. And I think China often, when you meet Chinese diplomats, they often remind people about that in New Zealand. And the Chinese do tend to take a long-term view on relations. It may be that the Luxon government is beginning to be more clear-eyed about Trump.
Just elaborate on that, please.
Well,
you're about to anyway. I interrupted you. Sorry. Elaborate.
No. I was just going to say that I think the conventional wisdom within the Luxon-led government was Trump's difficult, but we'll find a way to work with him, and we'll negotiate some sort of exemption deal to tariffs. But Trump is now doing things which are ripping up New Zealand's foreign policy and really assaulting it. And we haven't had any public comments. We haven't heard any comments of solidarity with Canada. We haven't heard any comments about questioning Mr. Trump calling Zelensky a dictator and being Ukraine being responsible for initiating the war, according to Mr. Trump. This is difficult stuff for allies of the United States to take. So the way I interpret it is that the penny is dropping in the government. China has given New Zealand something that the United States has never given New Zealand, which is a free trade agreement. And we better look after this relationship with China. It's difficult, but look at the great push that Luxon and Peters emphasised when they first came in, is that we must have even closer alignment with traditional allies like the US. And in Washington, we heard Mr. Peters and Mr. Anthony Blinken say, we have shared values. How can any national-led government now say we share Trump's values? So AUKUS has gone out the window, basically. I mean,
okay. This is what you said to me, because I don't think you've actually quite fessed up here. Are you making a statement here that you suspect that what Winston was doing was giving an early lead on that we won't go to AUKUS?
It may be code that we can work constructively with China. It's a special relationship. We've known each other a long time. There's difficulties. They're a dictatorship. We're not, but we'll try and make it work. And I think that may reflect what's happening in Washington to some degree, because it's very difficult now for the Luxon government to sell joining an enhanced security partnership, which is headed by America First Trump administration.
But isn't it going to be quite difficult when you've got China zipping down to the Tasman Sea, firing into the sea underneath a whole bunch of airliners going back and forth, and doing a deal with the Cooks, which you could argue is...
I absolutely agree. China's pushing their luck. But, politics is often a choice between the disagreeable and the intolerable, isn't it? And it seems to me that was Edmund Burke said that, not me. But
Well, I think it was very close to the Oscar Wilde,
But look, I think the grievances with China are absolutely genuine. But let's be quite clear. There was a backdrop to why China did what it did. And that related to irritation with, as Helen Clark has pointed out, I think she pointed out last week, the Chinese were irritated by the fact that Australia in particular had been, and it's quite within their rights, sending ships through the Taiwan Straits in international waters. China, of course, views that as provocation, which it's not. But they have, if you like, retaliated or responded by carrying out these military exercises involving live fire in international waters. So, yes, they didn't do much on the notification front, and they're clearly trying to make a point. But I think, and I've always worried about this, that China has been emboldened by the Trump administration. They see Trump as weak and disorganized and incoherent, so they're going to take advantage. And it seems to me that that's not helping New Zealand's position. I think look, let's not oversell this, Peter. What I was trying to say was, I don't know exactly what Mr. Peters meant when he spoke about the special relationship with China. I think he was trying to say this is an important relationship to New Zealand. We mustn't take it for granted, must work with them as much as possible. But I think he has moved himself away from the position that he said publicly some time ago, that when push came to the shove, he was in Washington's corner. I think with Mr. Trump in Washington, that has changed New Zealand's government's reading of having closer alignment with the United States.
Exactly.
It's not that we're going to be unfriendly. We'll seek every possible area of agreement we can, but we won't do anything hasty either in our relations with China. And I think, in a sense, the challenge for New Zealand is not, is to maintain this delicate balancing act. And I think Mr. Peters sounded to me, if he was really pondering that in his radio interview when I heard him this morning.
Robert, just a quick swifty, because I noticed that Martin Wolf, the FT commentator on international affairs, who's a legendary socialist, said the headline, at least, and of course the commentator doesn't normally write the headline, but the headline is "The US is now the enemy of the West," and he quoted Franklin Roosevelt about defeating totalitarianism. And he says today, this is Martin, not FDR, not only are the autocracies increasingly confident, the US is moving to their side. That is the lesson of the last 2 weeks. Freedom is not as much in danger as it was in 1942, yet the dangers are very real.
Well, I think he's got a point. I mean, I think he's reflecting the view of many liberal democracies at the moment that feel that America is effectively, when I say America, I mean the Trump administration is effectively siding with its traditional enemies against liberal democracies. And,
exactly.
It's no secret that Trump has got the EU in the crosshairs, and we could expect some tariff action shortly.
Absolutely. Robert, thank you so much. It's very kind of you to do that. I've squeezed both Robert with the final question, and Robert's now going to take over with Ed. Please, Robert, thank you so much. I hope I didn't ruin your day by asking if you thought AUKUS was over, but thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert.
Thank you.
Lovely now to welcome Ed Miller into the show. Ed is a researcher based in Northland for the Centre for International Corporate Tax and Accountability Research, and has done a lot of work on the profits, the dividends, the investments of the electricity companies, has taken a really good look at the decisions around Marsden Point, and also the tax affairs of a whole bunch of companies involved in New Zealand. Ed, lovely to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me back. Great to be here.
Great. Ed, this week's been a big one in the electricity sector. There's been various announcements on government reforms, and a couple of the big gentailers, the 51% owned by the state gentailers, have come out with their annual results, and we've seen them talking about double-digit or near double-digit price increases. So, what did you make of those results, and whether this is going to be a problem for not just the economy but the government?
Yeah, a great question. I mean, this is sort of the chickens coming home to roost in a sense of the better part of a decade of underinvestment in generating capacity in this country. That's the price that we paid for saying we were better off letting the private sector run our electricity industry. We said it was a better system for the way we wanted to run our economy, to sell off a big chunk of three of the four big gentailers in our economy to private sector actors, and to let the dividends flow in the short term. That meant a pretty dramatic slowdown in the rates of capital investment across the board. But that was fine, apparently, because we had supply and demand in balance, because there wasn't sufficient demand to attract more capital investment into the network. That all came crashing into graphic relief last year when we started to see large-scale manufacturers, the major energy users in our economy, saying electricity prices are too high for us to keep operating. We are going to have to pull out of the country, and we saw, a lot of unemployment in rural regions as a result of that. The companies, the electricity companies, reported their results this week, and in the words of Neil Barclay, CE for Meridian, it was about taking a hit for the team. Most of them reported losses, which is a very unusual thing for our electricity companies to do. It means it was a very bad year. It was a dry year, right? And we have a majority hydro energy system. So in dry years, we have to call in the reserves, and the reserves in terms of our energy network is the gas. And if there's not enough gas to go around, then we are in major trouble. There is one kind of backup to that, to using gas, and that is to burn coal. So we saw Genesis burning coal, and Genesis has been stockpiling coal defensively, essentially, so that the cost of gas doesn't spike too high, and that the people that hold the gas contracts, in particular Methanex, aren't able to push up the value of those prices too much. The question is, will we see change as a result of these guys finally starting to generate losses rather than generate the windfall profits? Because if the gentailers aren't delivering profits, then the ability to deliver dividends falls apart, and the ability of the state to extract dividends from their majority holdings of three of the four big gentailers falls apart. So
Craig's always tells me that tell me that the investing in the gentailers is a one-way bet.
It always has been, but energy in general is a slow game, and it takes a long time for investment decisions to translate into profits or losses and that kind of a thing. And we are now seeing the result of that slow game, the long kind of suck out of profits from those companies, and the lack of capital investment that we have seen has really hit the fan here. So we saw from probably about 2021 that the ship started to turn, that the investment did start running into new generating capacity, but it takes a long time to bring these things online, a long time to get them consented, a long time to build them. You need skilled engineers to come into the country, all of that kind of thing. There has been a little bit more generating capacity coming online within the last 6 months. There was a big geothermal project down the line. I can't quite remember where, but geothermal is only in a certain part of the country, so it can't be too far from the sort of Waikato Central North Island. But it takes a long time to bring that in. The only sort of the only break in that game has been solar, which you can set up a lot quicker. And then at the other end of the spectrum is gas, which takes a long time to get out of the ground, particularly if that ground is sitting on a kilometre's worth of ocean, right? And that's the bet that our government has gone with, that we are better off repealing the offshore oil and gas ban.
So Nicola Willis and previously Simeon Brown talked tough about reforming the electricity system, making it more competitive, from a pure political and economic point of view, they don't like it when their consumers and voters have just been hit with another near double-digit increase in their power bills, and a whole bunch of the industrial base evaporates because they can't afford the power. So there's been a little bit of action here and there, a few announcements. Do we think the government is serious and able to get a surge of competition and new investment and capacity that will help solve this problem and take some pressure off consumers and businesses?
Yeah, the announcements that we saw today are good. There's no doubt about that. I mean, that's about, as the way the government has presented it, it's about creating a more even keel for retailers, so that the big gentailers don't completely dominate the retail market, and that the smaller retailers are able to get hold of the hedging contracts, or basically the insurance contracts for future pricing to prevent prices from going too high, to be able to get those on the same terms that the gentailers are able to buy them. Because when you think about our market, we have the generators on one side, we have transmission, we have distribution, and then we have retail on the other side. And the gentailers control two sides of that equation, and then are able to game it for their own profitability. So putting those non-discrimination obligations that they're talking about putting in, I think will be helpful. They will prevent what we've seen in the last couple of years, which has been a departure from a lot of the smaller independent retailers in the industry. If we can bring some back into the industry, that would be great, but it's a small stick. The government has much bigger sticks that it can use to whack this industry, and is not touching them at the moment.
Including structural separation. Just finally on Marsden Point.
Excuse me.
Well,
you can do the final one. I thought can I interject to do the final one, and then you do the final one?
Sure.
Ed and Bernard.
Yep.
Isn't there a weird linkage in comparison between the way this power thing has arrived and as a story, and the privatization of them and our dependence on them? You know, I mentioned Craig's always says to me, put more money into the gentailers, and I just think that's, put more money in, I find it odd. And the supermarkets. There's an absolute failure here to understand what competition really means, isn't there? Or maybe in New Zealand, competition in electricity is a bad idea. I mean, you're the expert in this, Ed, but Bernard pretends to be an expert as well. And, don't let me get you started on housing either.
No, go for it, Ed.
Well, I think Bernard's doing a great job of pretending. I couldn't tell. It's a really interesting question, and I've been mulling it over myself. How is it that we have these two industries that are both kind of responsible for windfall profits at the cost of consumers on all sides of the equation, where you have such kind of lockstep relationships in the ownership of production between wholesale and retail? I think it would be a great little thesis for somebody to do some work on, but I don't have any insights.
Ed, bugger theses. We're bloggers and podcasters. We do not have the time or the skill to. I mean, Bernard probably does,
no,
but we just have to posit these as written.
This is capitalism 101, which is you buy control of the means of production, and then you use that to maximize your profits and minimize your costs, and at the same time lock out competitors. And one of the great things about supermarkets and electricity is that to create something useful, you have to buy land and get agreement from authorities to create something expensive and that takes a long time to build, and that means supermarkets, and particularly chains of supermarkets and networks for distribution. That is hard. That's an RMA mess in itself, and the same with the electricity companies. They've the capital you need to get in there to generate, and then in effect, you can't really compete as a retailer unless you've got generation, we've discovered, and that's the crux of it.
We don't need a thesis. We just need a little ending point from Bernard.
Oh, you can copy and paste that. Yeah, it's faster than the 3 years it takes as well. Yeah.
I mean, I do think the land ownership games that you're talking about, Bernard, are played by both industries, right? If you're in the electricity generating industry, then the best thing for you to do is to buy up the land where somebody else would have put their solar farm, would have put their wind turbine farm, all of this kind of thing. It's the same in the supermarkets. You try and buy that land to prevent your competitors from buying the same spots as well. And the thing that happens also in the supermarket game is you do see the supermarket chains trying to creep their way up the production chain as well.
Pam's.
Pam's.
Pam's is actually a New World conspiracy, isn't it?
Yeah, that's Pam's.
Big
Yeah.
Pam.
Thank you, Ed. Sorry, Bernard, you got another one. You got a final one.
Final one on the energy front, and for a complex up near where you live, Ed, Marsden Point. Marsden Point closed under a Labor government because the owners of it, private oil companies, decided that there wasn't enough profit in it anymore, and they were going to shut it down, and the government seemed to think it was okay at the time. Now we've discovered actually it's useful to have your own refinery. You save an awful lot of money in foreign exchange, and you buy yourself a lot more resilience if there's some sort of drama in the world shipping lanes, because we're now completely dependent on those shipping lanes, which we discovered this week. You can shut down with a ship or two if you've got malign intent, and we've only got 18 days worth of diesel that we have in our tanks in New Zealand. That's essentially what China was telling us this week, that we can shut down your economy in 18 days now that you don't have a refinery. Yeah, so we've heard from Christopher Luxon now that he'd quite like to build a new one.
Oh, at least Jesus Christ.
Start it up again.
Sorry, excuse me, Philippa.
Yes. So Ed, what did you think about this? The government now talking about, maybe we need a refinery now.
It was a wholly predictable set of conclusions to had come to from somebody who was in Parliament but not paying attention at the time. I was doing a lot of work around this at the time because I was the researcher at First Union, and it was a First Union site. It was a very important site for the union because it was not only was it 100% union, but it was a kind of a strategic link in one of the most important kind of energy supply chains in the country, if not the most important. At the time, we pitched the idea to government of a form of intervention which we thought would be very cheap and would give us a bit of time. And we weren't saying, let's keep Marsden Point open forever. We were very aware of the transition, but there was no other fuel security plan or energy security plan in place at the time. So what we said to government was, let's play the same role that the current shareholders play with Refining NZ, which is to set up what they call a fee, floor and cap system. Because the whole concern that Refining NZ had was around the margins, the refining margins being unpredictable, right? So they had set up what's called a fee, floor and cap, which is when the margins fall below the floor, that they get topped up by the shareholders, and when they go above the cap, then the margins pay the shareholders back. We said government should step into that position, underwrite the margins when they go too low, and when margins start going high, that they go into an account that pays off the future margins. So they always stay within that fee, floor and cap, and that there's always a stable, predictable return. Government listened, and there was a cabinet paper that came out that sort of canvassed this idea but didn't take it on. About a month later, Russia invaded the Ukraine, or invited them in. I'm not sure what the current language is. And refining margins went from the top of the cap of the fee floor that was in place at the time was about $9 per barrel. The refining margins went to $35 per barrel. So
nice work if you can get it.
Nice work if you can get it. That fund would have been full for years to come, and there would have been ample space for us to get the pen and pad out and work out what the energy security plan was going to be.
Ed, I just want to intervene in this slightly, because I reckon if we did a fast backwards, a rewind to the Hoon maybe 3 years ago, where I was Bernard goes down all these sort of socialist routes, and there's Catherine there worried about the climate. It was the most appallingly unstrategic decision, which was built on a dream about when we were going to get renewables.
Well, actually, it was more of a short-term need by three shareholders basically to get out of something they didn't want to be in, and didn't want the risk, as you can expect as private owners. And the Labor government And I still am scratching my
bought
head.
into it.
I need to have a chat with Megan Woods. Or what on earth were they doing? Why did they
Not
let
listening
this
to
happen?
Ed. Not listening to Ed is the main thing. So Bernard, because I was trying to catch you there, because I reckon you were just advocating that we did need the refinery, and I'm
Well-
absolutely certain that a forensic search of our podcast from maybe 3 years ago would say you were just,
Yep. No.
possibly around the time
I-
that you bought a Leaf.
Yeah. No. I'm all for going solar, but just deciding to get out of that refinery right then wasn't so clever. In retrospect, I wish I'd known more about your paper at the time, Ed. But
Wish I had a copy of it. It's lost in the opinion file somewhere.
Yeah, and it is one of these really interesting what ifs. Is it too late to restart it, or is everything
Yes.
been chopped down and cut up and everyone's gone?
Yeah, it's categorically too late. I mean, it's not too far from here to get to the Marsden Point site. There's most of what was there has been ripped apart. The conspiratorial minders amongst us said that was being done on purpose. I think, if you've got an industrial site, you want to have it in use for something, right? And to have a rusty old refinery that's no longer there is not going to drive any value. So,
But since it's got poisoned soil, why don't we just put a retirement home there like they have on the rest of Marsden Point?
well, it's not too far away from the Bream Bay
know.
Oceania facilities. But it depends what your objective is.
And really, finally, from me, Ed, what do we do about this? What? I mean, if we're worried about 18 days of diesel and several $1 billion of current account deficit, how would we solve this problem as fast as we could, as efficiently and productively as possible?
Well, so I was reading about the energy network in Pakistan today, which is something we all do on most occasions. But something that's been really fascinating that has taken place in Pakistan is a massive rollout in solar. And the reason for that massive rollout in solar that has taken place is because of the collapse of the distribution network. The electricity hasn't been able to get around the country effectively, so people have taken on their own. They've bought solar themselves, and they've used solar to power their own factories, their own shops, their own farms, and this kind of a thing. It is possible for us to do a really fast rollout of electricity, and I don't think it's just with a collapsed grid. We can build a lot of renewable energy very, very quickly, but we actually have to invest in it. We have to put some money down. We have to look at the Treasury accounts and say we're going to have to be a bit soft on some of these measures. The very close net debt requirements that are in place and are critically important, according to the people in Treasury who don't listen to the bond traders themselves. We have to put some money out there, and we have to realize that this is the kind of investment that not only gives us energy security in the long term, but lowers our cost of living in the long term.
And
Ed, can we vote for you somewhere?
Yes. and it turns out our largest trading partner makes an awful lot of this stuff and may struggle to get it into other places, and would quite like to sell it cheaply to
And we
us,
have a
I'm
special
sure.
relationship with them. On that note, do we need to let Ed go and these poor readers who are dying to
Thank
get
you.
over to find out what the sport happened today on TVNZ News?
Thank you so much, Ed. It's time
Ed,
now
thank
for
you
the
very much,
skateboarding.
Ed.
The skateboarding
Oh
dog.
yeah, well you
Peter.
do it because it's your skateboarding dog.
Yes,
And then I'm going to do a supplementary kind of closing off skateboarding dog.
Cool. So this is sort of circling back to our discussion at the beginning of the show about the Associated Press being essentially locked out of some press events, and how the Agence France Presse, which is the French version of Associated Press and Reuters, essentially managed to smuggle in the Associated Press reporter into the event in a typically franche, up the man. We're going to protest this. We're excellent protesters to get there. So I love the sort of Frenchness of that.
Excellent. No, I totally agree. And there is a chap I know in Pennsylvania is pushing for a NATO of news, where news organizations start to support each other and walk out. However, we know Joe Rogan and the other ratbags would walk straight in. I just want to say that in the New York Times review, which I recommend to everybody, of Michael Wolff's book, there's a tiny excerpt from the book, and it says, "What excites Trump most is not the fire, but the clanging fire engines and sirens rushing to the scene." And the reviewer goes on to say, either way, when the fire trucks come, one thing is certain, Michael Wolff will be hanging off the back.
Yeah. Good fun.
Bernard, I'll see you
Good
shortly
fun.
for Dindins.
Yes. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, everyone. Have a great weekend.
And
We'll see
thank
you
you,
all
everybody.
next Thursday. Catch ka kite anō.
Poor Simon.
And we are stopping it there.